All right, so this is going to be session 3, and dealing with the emergence of one God. Friedman asks the question, how do we get from the Exodus to monotheism? The probability that we have raised earlier on is that the Levites left Egypt. They spent some time in the region of Midian. They came to Israel and became part of it, and they became its priests. And their deity, Yahweh, and the land's deity, El, came to be seen as one God. The merger of Yahweh and El was the key to the idea, evolution, and spread of monotheism as viewed through literary sources in the development of a linear history in which one God was present in the very early stage of Israel's history before Israel and Judah even had their first kings. Friedman asked 2 questions. When did the idea of monotheism emerge, and when did it catch on? If we could please, I have to mute. Okay. Many scholars believe that Israel was not monotheistic until a very late stage in the biblical world. Many verses in the Bible seem somewhat vague as to whether there was one God, many gods, or one God who was supreme to other gods. He cites in the Song of the Sea, who is like you among the gods, Yahweh? And the Hebrew is very familiar as Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai. In the creation story, after God has completed the creation of the universe, our world and all of the vegetation, animals, flying creatures, and aquatic sea creatures, he then creates humans. In the story, God speaks in the plural, let us make man in our image. The book of Job has an assembly of the gods meeting with Yahweh, and the sons of the gods, B'nai Elohim, came to assemble upon God. And even in the 10 Commandments that says, you shall have no other gods before me. In each of these verses, other gods are explicit or implied. Do these texts then dismiss Yahweh as the one God? Friedman explains. A common view among Bible scholars for a long time has been that this idea, one God, was a later development in Judaism. They say it was a product of exile. The Jews had no monotheism until after the Babylonians drove them out of their country in 587 BCE and deported thousands of them to Babylon. Before the exile, they believed in and worshiped many gods, or they followed one God out of many gods, which is referred to as henotheists. An example comes from the covenant code found in Exodus 22. One who sacrifices to gods shall be completely destroyed, except to Yahweh alone. And Friedman says that it does not say that other gods don't exist. It just says that one should not sacrifice to them. Many biblical scholars say this is not monotheism. To further their view, they argue that when the Jews were exiled to Babylonia, how were they to explain that their omnipotent, omniscient God didn't protect them from defeat and while they were in exile? A verse from Psalm 137, which is read on Tisha B'Av, Al Naharot Babel, by the waters of Babylon. And it says, how shall we sing a song of Yahweh on foreign soil? This verse does prove that Yahweh was the Judean or Jewish God before the exile, but the Jews clearly had some explaining to do to their captors. Were the Babylonian gods more powerful than Yahweh? The Judean exiles responded, Yahweh is the one and only God, the God of all earth, of Judah, of Babylon, everywhere. Much of the liturgy for Tisha B'Av, and possibly the Selichot prayers on Yom Kippur, probably came from or were influenced by this mindset, and their prayers and theology said that Yahweh is all-powerful. It is we, the people said, who abandon Yahweh by worshiping other gods, false gods. By violating the first of the 10 commandments, God punished Judah by the Babylonian destruction of the temple and the defeat and exile of the people. But what about the previous verse from the Song of the Sea, Genesis, Job, and the 10 Commandments? How do you explain all of those verses that refer to the gods or the sons of gods? Friedman says that many of his colleagues cite verses from 2nd Isaiah. He explains how the prophet Isaiah's writings are divided into first, written before the exile, and 2nd Isaiah, while in exile in Babylon, are really two prophecies separated by 2 centuries, and that it's 2nd Isaiah that many biblical scholars use to prove that monotheism was post-exilic. In the 2nd Isaiah, God says, I am Yahweh, and there is not another. Except for me, there is no God. In Isaiah 44:6, I am the first and I am the last. And outside of me, in the Hebrew, this term comes up very frequently, mibalade, there is no God. From Isaiah 43:10-12, before me, no God was formed. And after me, there will not be. I am Yahweh, and outside of me, again, that term, mibalade, there is no savior. Friedman says that despite these verses, I did not believe it then, and I am even more certain now. We have also looked to Egypt, Midian, and to earliest Israel. We have seen that at least the monotheistic impulse ignited from that very early stage, the Levites arrived from Egypt. And Israel identified Yahweh and El as one and the same God. And this evolved from an impulse onto a religious doctrine. The term Ibalade appears in earlier sources in Israel's history, which, according to Friedman, were all in poetry. He cites 2 biblical scholars, Frank Moore Cross and Noel Friedman, who state that a royal song of thanksgiving found in 2 Samuel and Psalm 18 were written no later than the 9th to the 8th centuries BCE, and possibly as early as the 10th century BCE, long before the Babylonian exile. Who is God outside Mibalade of Yahweh? And who is a rock outside Mibalade of our God? And the Song of Moses, which is found in Deuteronomy chapter 32, was written in archaic Hebrew before the Babylonian exile. I am he, and there are no gods. Several verses from Deuteronomy are very clear as to there being no other God but Yahweh. The most famous is the Shema Yisrael that we recite every day in our prayers. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. In fact, this, even though we recite it as a prayer every day, it is really the declaration of faith. When we say it again, Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. Friedman then cites other sources attributed to the author of Deuteronomy. In his book, Who Wrote the Bible, Friedman identified the Deuteronomist as Jeremiah because of the similarities in style, grammar, and syntax in the book of Jeremiah. The Deuteronomist begins his work with Deuteronomy and then edits and organizes the next 6 books, Judges, in which we find the Song of Deborah, 1st and 2nd Samuel. And King David is the subject, and 1st and 2nd Kings, all written before the Babylonian exile. Friedman quotes a verse from 1 Kings. So that all the peoples of the earth will know that Yahweh, He is God. There is not another. Now compare this verse with a very familiar verse that we recite 3 times a day as part of the Aleinu prayer. And you shall know today and store it in your heart that Yahweh, He is God in the skies above and on the earth below. There is not another. V'yadata hayom v'ashevota el lebabecha hu Adonai hu Elohim al hashamayim v'al haaretz. All right, for the skies above and on the earth below. There is not another. But the last part you would recognize when we sing in the Shehunet Hashamayim. He is our God in the skies above and on the earth below. Then the earth below, there is not another. If you remember that, for the just singing to the English. Many of the prophets also refer to the oneness of God. The prophet Hosea precedes 2nd Isaiah by a couple of centuries. Hosea has God saying, I am Yahweh your God from the land of Egypt, and you shall know no God except me. There is no Savior but me. All the above verses show that monotheism was firmly entrenched in the minds of the people. The idea and the texts and persons who championed it, all of these were in place before the Babylonians arrived. Words are fine to express one's love, but actions speak louder than words. What action could solidify monotheism in the minds of the people of ancient Israel? The answer: centralization of worship. The books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy stress that all sacrifices must be conducted by the priests in one central location. As the Levites journeyed in the desert, the tabernacle, or the tent of meeting, was the only place where sacrifices were allowed to take place. During the first temple period, sacrifices could only take place in the Holy of Holies. We do know that anyone offering sacrifices outside the temple or the temple were banished from the community. Friedman pauses his discussion of whether monotheism was pre-exilic or post-exilic by examining the linguistic evidence of these sources. On the question, one second. On the question that we are addressing here, though, the question of when various texts were written, this state of the field has been particularly vexing. A recent article written by Jennifer Schussler in the New York Times on this very subject describes a doctoral dissertation by Idan Dershowitz. The title of the article is a long dismissed forgery actually the oldest known biblical manuscript? And I want to thank Jack Elder for bringing it to my attention. Also, Susan Vishner also sent me the article as well. She begins the article by giving the background of a discovery in 1883 of 15 manuscript fragments in Paleo-Hebrew script by Moses William Shapira of Jerusalem. And he was an antique dealer and maybe a little bit of an archaeologist, but he was really an antique dealer. These fragments, he believed, contained what he believed was the original book of Deuteronomy. Shapiro shared his findings with the British Museum. It attracted worldwide attention. And while museum experts pored over the fragments, a French archaeologist, Charles-Simon Clermont-Ganneau, was allowed to examine some of the fragments. After viewing these fragments, Clermont-Ganneau declared them to be a forgery. Museum experts agreed, and ultimately Shapiro, disgraced, committed suicide 6 months later, and the manuscript essentially disappeared until recently. Idan Dershowitz, an American-Israeli scholar, argues in a recently published paper that the manuscript was an authentic ancient artifact. The thrust of his paper is that the manuscript was pre-Babylonian exile, dating to the period of the First Temple, making it the oldest known biblical manuscript. The article is lengthy, well worth reading, and gives us insight into the complexities of biblical scholarship. I will send everyone the link in an email. And I want to thank, again, said Jack Eld and Susan Vishner for sending me this article. Friedman concludes a discussion of the significance of language as to when Israel became monotheistic. We can distinguish between the classical Hebrew of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah on the one hand, and the late biblical Hebrew of Judah after the exile on the other. The dividing line is essentially pre-exile versus post-exile Hebrew. The merger of El and Yahweh was the first step, a very early first step on that stairway. The merger is what the Levite priests taught all of Israel and Judah from some of the earliest known texts, and it never went away. One God. And it continued to surface in texts that we have seen before, during and after the Babylonian exile, from the 11th century BCE to the end of the biblical period. Friedman continues by discussing the issue of many gods versus one God. He asks the question, how did their writers depict it in the Bible? They said that the gods used to exist, but they died. In the Song of Moses near the end of the Torah, it says, when the highest gave nations legacies, when he dispersed humankind, he set the people's borders to the number of the children of Israel, B'nai Israel. It's a confusing verse and does not seem to make sense. Friedman then references this same verse from the Dead Sea Scrolls, except in the Scrolls version, instead of B'nai Israel, it says B'nai Elohim, the children of the gods, assigning each god to one of the nations. For example, Greece to Zeus, and so forth and so on. The next verse says, Yahweh's portion is his people. Jacob is the share of his legacy. Yahweh keeps Israel for himself. There are other verses that refer to the existence of other gods in the Bible. Michamocha ba'ilim Adonai, who is like you among the gods, Yahweh. Give to Yahweh your children of the gods, B'nai Elohim, from Psalm 29. And the children of God, the children of the gods, came to stand before Yahweh in the book of Job. In all three verses, the gods exist, but God is higher than all of them. They exist, and in Genesis 6:1, chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, they take human women for wives. And Yahweh said, my spirit won't stay in humankind forever, since they are also flesh, and their days shall be 120 years. Okay. Out of these unions were born the Nephilim, some sort of superhumans. And we truly don't understand them. We don't know them. There's no other description about them except in one other place, and that is in the book of Numbers. And they appear again in the story of the spies in Numbers. We see the Nephilim there, sons of giants from the Nephilim, and we were like grasshoppers in our eyes, and so we were in theirs. And of course, this is the very famous verse that the spies came back with. And of course, this set in motion the fact that ultimately that the Israelites would wander in the desert for 40 years because they didn't have faith in God. Seeing potential problems with humans living for hundreds of years or longer, God limits the lives of humans to 120 years, the age when Moses dies. This is where we get the expression, we should live to 120, and a possible clue to how the gods died. Now, Friedman cites the entire text of Psalm 82, which we recite every Tuesday as the Shir Shel Yom, the Psalm of the Day. And I will focus on verses 1, 6, 7, and 8. Verse 1, God is standing in the divine assembly. He judges among the gods. Verse 6, I had said, you are gods and children of the highest, all of you. Verse 7, but like a human you will die, and like one of the rulers you will fall. And verse 8, arise God, judge the earth, because you give legacies among the nations. These verses, especially verse 8, refers to the Song of Moses. Verse 7 refers to God limiting humans living to 120 years with a reference that rulers or gods will fall. Psalm 82 contains their myth of the death of the gods. There are 3 verses in the Bible that refer to God in the plural, and they all appear in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. These are the only times they appear, and they end with the story of the Tower of Babel. Why? Okay. I apologize. Now it is not cooperating. Okay. The disappearance of the divine plural occurs right there at the Tower of Babel, 100% consistent with the demise of the gods and verse 8 in Psalm 82. God's relationship with the gods, or children of the gods, is over immediately after God interacts directly with humans when he appears to Abraham in Genesis 12:7. And Yahweh said to Avram, go from your land and from your birthplace and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Lech lecha me'artzecha mi'oladecha mi'beit avicha. A very famous verse, and that's how the Parsha Lech lecha starts off, and this is how we are introduced to Abraham. So just as that picture then, the Tower of Babel, in which God disperses the people who want to try to be like God, and disperses them and babbles their language, so they can't communicate with one another, and they have to now really make the effort to try to communicate. Not going to make it easy for them. And so now these gods or these superhumans, they are done, and now God now will deal directly with humans, not with the sons of God or the children of gods or the gods themselves. And soon, right after with Abraham, his first encounter with Abraham, from this point on, it takes up the rest of the Bible. The Torah does not explain why God chose Abram to be his first human partner. The rabbis tried to fill in the missing pieces by using a midrash, a lesson or a story to explain what is unwritten. what is unsaid. In this case, Avram's father was an idol maker. One day, young Avram smashes the idols, saying that these idols can't be gods because they're handmade. God remembered what Avram had done, and when the time was right, he would approach Avram. We now return to the question I quoted Friedman when we asked, how do we get from the Exodus to monotheism? Monotheism prevailed, but if the Exodus had not happened, monotheism would have developed either later, completely differently, or it might not have ever happened at all. But, as Friedman says, that's not all. If there was an Exodus from Egypt, just of Levites, who later emerged with the Israelites, this was a crucial event in the formation of monotheism. But there is much more, I think. The Exodus not only gave birth to theological consequences, it also had ethical consequences. Love your neighbor as yourself. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is one of the most famous verses from the Bible. Friedman writes that it appears in a text from the Kingdom of Judah around 700 BCE. Biblical scholars have debated the use of the term neighbor, re'ah. Many scholars believe it means love your neighbor or your fellow Jews or Israelites as yourself. Not very inclusive. But if you interpret re'ah as meaning another, then the 52 references that appear only in Levite sources, EP and D, to treat the alien in an inclusive manner, or at the very least, fairly, makes complete sense. And now I'm going to, this worked when I tried it earlier, and hopefully it'll work now, a recording of an interview with Richard Elliott Friedman, Dan Levinson, and Lex Rosenberg of Judaism Unbound. And they have a plethora of these different kinds of interviews on Jewish topics. And so this one is episode 83, and it's an interview with Richard Elliott Friedman on his book, The Exodus. So hopefully this will work. And I have to, the specific point.
So slaves or not necessarily?
Can you hear that?
It's hard to tell. I think some, at least, of them may have been slaves, and others, or maybe they were oppressed. And the word oppression is the word more than slavery. It was probably slaves, because if you look in the law codes of E and P and D, they all mention slaves and have laws about slaves, mostly that even if you're going to have slaves, you have to treat them right. There are all these laws, well-known laws of the Torah that have rules about slavery. So there's evidence that, yeah, it's the Levites who have the experience of having been slaves. Do I get to turn this around, though? If you say, well, okay, you need to prove that the Exodus happened, but otherwise then it didn't happen. But no, what are the evidence? What's the arguments that it didn't?
I'm not the person to answer that most effectively, but I think the answer gets back to that. Everybody agrees, I think, about two premises. One is that there needs to be some level of evidence to claim that any event historically happened. And the other premise is that there is a threshold at which you decide, well, this is enough evidence, even though we can never really have 100% evidence. And once that threshold is reached, I think we all agree that you then say that an event happened. And I think where the debate is where that threshold is. It's where the level of evidence is and what kinds of evidence need to be present in order to make that determination. And I'm not the person to make the best argument for why the threshold has not been reached. I think you've put out a great argument for why it has been. But I really am curious to hear the second piece of the second piece of the puzzle, which is the why does it matter? Because I remember when we had you on in the past, you spoke about that it really does matter to you. Some people you've heard say that it's not important if it happened or not. It's just like it's a story, whatever. And that's certainly how I have occasionally spoken about it. Like the point for me isn't that the Exodus happened or not. It's that we have this amazing model and story or myth or whatever the right term is that we can learn from and apply to our lives today in a variety of ways. And that's how I've framed it. But you gave, I think, a compelling set of reasons why we really should care.
Okay, sure. Well, the alien part, obviously, if you, I mean, that's really the culmination of the book. And I certainly didn't mean it when I wrote the book in terms of current politics in the United States where there's issues of aliens at this very moment. I mean, I had all of this and was lecturing about it and writing about it prior to the current political state of things. I've been working on this for a couple of years. But the relevance of it is just so clear that a principle was established that far back, and only in Israel that far back, that you treat aliens the same as citizens. And that's the law in the United States too. I mean, we didn't get that out of nowhere in our country, that if a Frenchman comes to the United States and he gets sued by a Native American and they both go to court, the judge and the jury have to treat the Frenchman and the American the same. And if the Frenchman commits a crime, he has to go on trial for it, but he can have a lawyer and a jury and a trial, the same as I can. And that's tremendous. That principle didn't come out of nowhere, and we can treasure it more if we know that it came out of not out of nowhere, but as part of our people's whole being. Once a culture has been thinking about something for 3,000 years, it's very deeply embedded in that culture. And monotheism, likewise, not everybody has to be a monotheist. You can be a polytheist, an atheist, an agnostic, or whatever, but you have to recognize that monotheism played this significant role, for good or bad. It played the significant role in this human adventure on Earth for the last 3,000 years, roughly, 2.5 to 3. And that started with this.
I'm thinking about an analogy to...
Okay. I'm going to stop at this point. And I'm going to, does anybody have any questions or any comments or reactions to what Friedman just said, or other things that you had written, that were written earlier, we discussed earlier? I'm going to do a stop share for now and just do the full gallery. Okay. So, anyone? No one. Okay. All right. Well, then we're gonna just, I'll go back to screen sharing. Oh, here we have 3 chats, 3 questions here. Let's see. Oh. Okay. All right. All right. All right. So to iterate, just some selections relating some of the 52 references to the treatment of the alien. From Exodus 12:49, which is a Levite P source. There shall be one Torah for the citizen and the alien that resides among you. From Exodus 22, and you shall not persecute an alien, and you shall not oppress him, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not persecute him. The alien who resides with you shall be like a citizen of yours, and you shall love him as yourself, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. And this is the very famous V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. All right, and the preceding verse says, the alien who resides with you shall be like a citizen of yours, because you were aliens in the land of Egypt. And finally, you shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you were an alien in his land. There are laws that also govern how we are to conduct war. Specifically, there are only three nations or people, the Canaanites, the Amalekites, and the Midianites, against whom wars were of a brutal nature. And each were very specific, at least for the first two, and for all of them. The Canaanites, that is the Battle of Jericho, in which Joshua, famous spiritual, Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. There's a little bit of the interview there in which Friedman talks about that, and we might be able to hear that tonight in a bit. But specifically, the Canaanites with the Battle of Jericho, and Friedman says it never happened. Biblical scholars say it never happened. Okay. With the Amalekites, based on the biblical story, Amalek attacked the Israelites in Sinai from the rear. And who is always located in the rear? The infirmed, the elderly, women, children, those who are most vulnerable and who are least able to fight back. And it's for that reason that we have in Deuteronomy, at the very end of the Torah portion, Kitetse, the Maftir portion is known as Zachor, and the Shabbat before Purim is called Shabbat Zachor, because we are to remember. We remember what Amalek did, how he tried to destroy the Israelites on their way to Israel, to Canaan. And we associate Haman with Amalek. And we know what our practices are for the holiday of Purim and what we're supposed to do as Haman's name comes up in the Megillah reading. But the Midianites, there's the biblical story of Phinehas, who is an Aaronite priest, the grandson of Aaron, and how he killed a Midianite and an Israelite by thrusting a spear through them. Laws of war against all other nations are for traditional political and economic reasons, such as the defense or territory. In far more laws and cases, the treatment of aliens is positive. Rape of captured women is prohibited. Massacre of a people of besieged city is prohibited. Women and children can be captured, but may not be killed. They must be treated humanely. And then I just also want to bring out one other point in reference to the Midianites, which seems a little bit odd, given the fact that Moses, his father-in-law, was a Midianite. He married a Midianite, Zipporah. But later on, after Zipporah apparently dies, Moses remarries, and he marries again, they say, a Midianite, and he's criticized by Miriam and by Aaron for doing so. And it was a political statement, because Midianites didn't even exist by the time that this particular statement was written. So what we're really looking at here was a criticism of Moses as well. Friedman gives other examples of the use of the word re'ah in the stories of the Tower of Babel, Judah and Tamar, and when the Israelites were leaving Egypt. You can find those on pages 200 to 210. I apologize. All right. The Exodus led to both monotheism and love and respect toward others. The two great consequences of this really early stage of religion. Okay, now it's moving. The two great consequences of this early stage of religion were a theological one, namely monotheism, and an ethical one, namely love of one's fellow and the alien. The two, ethics and monotheism, went hand in hand from the beginning, and this we call ethical monotheism. And I'm going to play another part of the interview.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode...
I apologize there. Okay.
This is Judaism Unbound.
And I mean, that's what historians do.
That we didn't wipe out anyone. I mean, I guess the question is, when we look back into history and we try to, derive, the elements that we can say that really happened for all the reasons that you and I think agree about, that the value of that. How do we contend with some of the things that probably did happen that we might not feel very good about?
Never happened in the Bible. I'm just saying all the most famous cases, the ones people always draw, are actually the most questionable ones. I mean, Moses has to massacre the Midianites, including all the Midianite women, if they're virgins and all. Well, that story is only written in the latest source, a priestly source, which happened 400 years after the Midianite League had ceased to exist. It's a polemical story against Moses for having a Midianite wife. I don't try to clean up the Bible and clean every bad thing that's in there. And you could even say if these stories aren't historical, still they're in there and people have taken them as historical, so they may have inspired violence. So there's no reason to lie and clean up everything that we don't like in the Bible. There are things that we don't like. But what I said in the book, at least, is if we're going to do that, if we're going to cherry pick all the cases in the Bible where there's something negative, then we can do that as long as we acknowledge at the time that what we're doing is cherry picking. Yes, accept the bad. Don't sweep it under the carpet. Acknowledge it. But I understand when you're doing that. But yes, these are some bad things in the context of a good book.
So first of all, I really want to say, because we've disagreed, or at least you and I have disagreed to some extent in here, that I really, really cherish and value being able to have this conversation. And I hope the listeners out there, wherever they are on the Exodus question, find somebody who sees it differently and can engage with it like this. But so as we think about this a little more in terms of how we apply it to our lives today, I'm thinking back to what you said about the monotheism point, about how how there seems to be a pretty good indication that Israel was the first or one of the first groups that embraced monotheism on some level. And I guess I'm thinking, because Dan and I have spoken about this a little bit, we have a set of issues in contemporary Jewish life where more and more people either identify themselves as atheists or as at least agnostics, or maybe they're not even sort of on that spectrum. It's just they're not really engaging with the question of God. If you were taking this text and talking about the contributions of Israelites or Jews, as you put it, you're a BCE guy, in BCE, in a space where perhaps a lot of people are not theists, how would you look to communicate that in a way that both empowers those who do believe in God and for whom that's an important part of how they operate and they see that as part of their Jewish identity, and those who don't, but are still looking to live in this civilization or group or people known as the Jews?
I know Jews of every kind. and some believe in God and some don't, and some are agnostic. People say that the real truth is that we're all agnostics because we don't really know. Or there's the old line, in the medieval times in the church, they would say, what is the difference between the bishop and the atheist? And it was the bishop believes during the day, but he doubts at night. And the atheist doubts during the day, but he believes at night. For most Jews, it's more important how you live and some of the other things we talk about, how you treat aliens. You can tell the story of God in the Bible, no matter what. God is one of the major players in the story. There's two major characters in the dynamic of the Bible, which is God and Israel. But I've now been teaching for 41 years, and I don't believe I have a student who knows if I believe in God or not.
In closing, I'm just wondering if you could give us some of your thoughts on what you would like to see as the way that, let's say, regular Jews, regular non-Jews.
Okay. Friedman closes with the 10 Commandments make a perfect finale for the path we have been following. They go from 1, being brought out of Egypt, 2, monotheism, to 3, to not coveting what belongs to somebody else, your re'ah, your neighbor. It has been over 3,000 years. Why does anybody care all that much whether the Exodus happened or not? Why care whether it happened the way it is told in the Bible? Why? Because history matters. What happened matters. Understanding how ideas got started and why people hang on them matters. The exodus of a group of people from Egypt happened. It made a difference. It still makes a difference. For Jews around the world, it truly does make a difference, because we tell the story of the Exodus every year at the Passover Seder. Whether you are Haredi, modern Orthodox, conservative, Reform, or Reconstructionists, families and friends come together to tell the story and sing the songs in the traditional manner or in their own way, employing meaningful customs and songs that reflect their comfort level. It was God who took us out of Egypt, and we are reminded throughout the Seder that it was God who performed the miracles. We remember that the Egyptians suffered by taking 10 drops of wine from our cups to diminish our happiness as we recite the 10 plagues. We don't say Shehecheyanu at candle lighting and Kiddush the last 2 days of the holiday, nor do we recite full Hallel the last 6 days of Pesach, all to remind us that the Egyptians suffered, died as the Israelites escaped slavery to become free. I hope that we can take away some valuable lessons from our study of Professor Friedman's book, and that we will share them at our Seders this year. After all, in our own way, we are experiencing our own exodus from this horrible world pandemic that has kept us locked down, masked, and physically separated from our families and friends for most of a year. Hopefully, the miracles of vaccines will bring us out of COVID-19 and reunite us with our loved ones. I now would like to I just have to see how I'm going to do this. I'm going to stop the screen sharing for a second. Okay, I know what I have to do. Yeah. I want to get out of the slideshow. Oh, good. Great. Okay. we're done with that. And I want to end. I thought it was appropriate and meaningful. Given everything that we have studied, I thought it would be great if we finished off with the wonderful song. And I happen to think it's the most beautiful song in the entire animated film, The Prince of Egypt, When You Believe. And I'm purposely not going to show you the words. I want you to just follow the visual and be able to experience it, just emoting, feeling it. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go back to sharing. All right.
Prayed with no proof anyone
Can you all hear it?
hear. In our hearts a hopeful song we barely understood. We are not afraid, although we know there's much to
I don't know about you, but every time I hear that song, and especially in light of our discussion and this whole thing, I actually get teary. It's just a beautiful, beautiful setting. And the whole, yeah, it shows thousands and thousands of people leaving Egypt and everything. And of course, we've debunked that, and that's okay. But that's up.
I take you into my home.
Sorry.
And this is how you repay me? By stealing? We wouldn't steal from you. We'd never do such a thing.
No, we wouldn't. Okay, that's good. And we're done with that. So, and I'm just going to be done with this altogether. Just get rid of it. Okay. Yeah, so it's just when you listen to the words, but I think just watching the visual, it's just really something, because, you know, we tell it every year. We celebrate a holiday and we get together with family and with friends. And I think probably now more than ever after this year, the last Pesach and this Pesach, in which we had to do it through virtual, through Zooming or FaceTime or whatever visual way that we could do it, a virtual way we could do it. I think that this really, I said to myself, I need to do this. This, I think, and everybody, hopefully you will agree, and that you'll walk away feeling a little bit uplifted. And like I said, you know, hopefully the miracle of vaccines will bring us out of the COVID and reunite us with our loved ones. And I want to finish by saying that we always end our Seders with the wish, next year in Jerusalem. My wish, and I am sure your wish, next year, together, in person, at our Passover Seders, with our family and friends and our loved ones. And on that, Chag Kasher V'Sameach, a happy and a kosher Pesach to all.